welcome to One History Help with me, Mrs. O'Neill, here to help you with all your GCSE history revision needs. This video is about 1920s America, and it's for people who are generally studying under the AQA Examining Board, as this fits in with the topic of America, Opportunity and Inequality, 1920 through to 1973. But of course, it's just historical knowledge, so even if you're not studying under that examining board, you can still use the information in here as well. So what you need now is up to you. You can just sit and watch through the PowerPoint if you like and listen to me talking through some of the points. Or if you want, you will probably need a pen or something to write with. Definitely recommend some highlighters. As any of you who've ever been taught by me will know, I'm a big fan of highlighting. And if you are a student of mine now, hopefully you have a sheet that can go along with this as well from a student shared area on our network, or possibly sent to you by your teacher. So as we go through, speed-wise, obviously you have the opportunity to pause this video whenever you like. So I'm just going to kind of keep going from one section to another without kind of slowing down as I would normally do in like an after-school revision session or something. So I think that's everything. Let's get started. So, like I said, we're looking at 1920s America. Now, the AQA exam board doesn't really divide it down into decades, but this is generally the easiest way to kind of get your head around the different decades that are needed. So here are the 7 different sections which I'm going to be going through. We are going to start off with why America got rich in the 1920s and grow right the way through there, as you can see, down to Prohibition. Prohibition is often something that people forget about 1920s America, so I'm really glad that we can insert it into what we're doing here. So just so you know, each slide that I go through is going to be comprised of 5 key points, and as much as I can, those points will include key dates, key names, key facts and key terms. This very much fits in with my beliefs to do with flashcards. Again, if you've been taught by me before, you will know that as well. So that's why there is a structure for that in mind. So let's get going with why America got rich in the 1920s. Your teachers may well have referred to it as the boom years, for instance. You might have well have looked at your study of America in terms of boom and bust, and it is very much the good times in that respect that we're going to be having a look at here. So why did America get rich in the 1920s? So one of the big things we need to be aware of is the politics of America in the 1920s. Now, those of you who are studying under AQA, politics isn't a huge part of our study. Technically speaking, our study is a social cultural study, but we do need to be aware that when we're talking about the economy and so on and so forth, like we are in the 1920s, we do need to be aware of political persuasions and political ideas as well. The 1920s was completely dominated by the Republican government. Hopefully your teachers have been through the different ideas about America's politics in terms of the Democrats and the Republicans, so I'm not going to go into that too much here. But in the 1920s, throughout, the presidents all had this very characteristic laissez-faire attitude. And again, if you've been taught by me before, you'll know this, but laissez-faire means don't really care. And essentially, it meant that the Republican government weren't going to interfere in people's lives. And it also extended into business as well, because we're thinking economically. The big people, the big leaders of business were very much trusted to go about their day-to-day business, and also in places to advise the government on what kind of economic policies should be going on. One of the things that they brought in pretty quickly to encourage people to spend was to lower people's taxes, raise their wages, and shorten how long that they were spending at work so that they had more free time. A pretty idyllic situation for sure, and definitely one that helped, because the fact that people had that disposable income meant that they were willing to buy new products. One of the things that most people on a daily basis wouldn't have been aware of was this idea of tariffs. Now, tariff is a tax that a government would charge on products being brought into the country, but also exports as well going out of the country too. The Fordney-McCumber tariff in 1924 is completely based on the idea of imports that are being brought into America from abroad. The Fordney-McCumber tariff made it very, very expensive for for products to be brought into America to be sold. So for instance, if I was, let me think, if I was a potato farmer, let's say over here in England, and I wanted to sell my potatoes over in America, the American government would charge me a very high price for those goods to be able to go into the American market for people to be able to buy. And consequently, my potatoes, good old O'Neill potatoes, would be very, very expensive, therefore, for people to buy. And if they're expensive, people aren't going to buy them. And the consequence of that meant that any goods that were made in America didn't have to pay the expensive tariffs to be brought into the country because they were already there. So it meant that American-made goods were very, very cheap to buy. If we go back to potatoes, for instance, O'Neill's English potatoes would be very, very expensive to buy because I would have to put in the price of the tariff into you buying one of my potatoes. But an American potato that was made in America, was grown in America, would cost you a fraction of the price because that American producer didn't have to pay any money on the tariff. So because American products are so cheap, of course people are going to buy those as opposed to the ones from abroad that are going to be much more expensive to buy. And what does that mean for American industry? It is a great thing. The more people are buying, the more people need to be having those products made. We get this idea a little bit here now of supply and demand. With this in mind, we start to see a massive strength in American industry coming through with mass production methods and assembly lines. Now, I'm sure lots and lots of you out there will have looked at Henry Ford as a great example of this. The idea that we'll use cars as the example, it went from just one person making the entire car to lots of people being involved in that process, but only being responsible for one particular part of the car itself. So say for instance I was making those cars, I would be responsible, say, for, I don't know, attaching the wheels, and then someone else was responsible for putting the glass in the windows, and it would shuffle along like that. And the way that the products were produced meant that they were produced a lot more quickly. Again, those of you who've studied Henry Ford, you've got lots of facts and figures that you can go to back up the idea and give a nice specific example of how much mass production really helped. Also, again, it helps with supply and demand because the demand for goods was so much higher, goods needed to be made a lot more quickly. And mass production methods and assembly lines are a massive way that can happen. So this is another part here. We're starting to kind of see the crossover. Those American-made goods which don't have to pay those tariffs and can be made in the factories on the assembly lines are going to be made super cheap. So lots of people are going to want to buy them. And along with that, people's wages have gone up, so they're going to want to buy them. They're not going to feel that they have to save their money for a rainy day or anything like that. They're going to be happy to spend that money. So what we're doing here is we're seeing how these different factors are starting to link together. Just kind of alluded to it there, previous to the 1920s and going back decades in American history, the attitude was to save your money, that you never knew what was coming around the corner and you would like to be prepared for that. That attitude has pretty much disappeared, and the First World War had something to do with that. People's attitudes, once a war is over, tend to change into more consumerism, the idea of not wanting to save things away because you've had your rainy day, you've had your bad times that you've gone through, now you want to enjoy life a little bit. Now, again, lots of products out there that were really cheap to buy, radios, for instance, your vacuum cleaners, lots of household products. But for those bigger items like the car, you could do something which is very, very common nowadays, especially this idea of hire purchase, where you could technically buy a product but pay for it later on. You've only got to watch some adverts for a little while and see, an advert for a sofa or something like that. The idea that you buy it now but pay for it next year. So that's how hire purchase worked back in the 1920s as well. Cars, again, are a great example of how this is done. Cars were a very big ticket item, but were made affordable by the fact you could buy it on credit, this idea of hire purchase. Buy the car, pay for it over time. Now, of course, that's all well and good, so long as you actually have the money to pay for it over time. Banks were very willing to give out loans during the 1920s. It's one of the reasons that leads to the Wall Street crash eventually, is this idea that banks were kind of giving money out left, right and centre. So again, if you were worried you couldn't afford it in the long run, then you could get a loan from the bank. But as we know today, we need to be careful even then to make sure we can pay the bank back as well. That kind of attitude, not so strong in America in the 1920s. Finally, on a wider government level, during World War I, America doesn't get involved until 1917, but it doesn't mean to say it shied away from it completely. During the First World War, especially to Britain and France, America gave money in the form of war loans to help them fight in the war. And once the war is over in 1918, that money comes rolling back into America. And what the American government chooses to do is to put that into the strength of their economy. For instance, being able to increase wages, being able to lower people's taxes, as we mentioned before as well. So the biggest and most influential group, arguably, you could say some of the other ones, are rich white Americans during the 1920s. These are the ones who are having a roaring 20s. These are the ones who are enjoying the boom years. And what we're going to be having a look at next is a little bit about what those rich white Americans spent their money on and spent their free time doing. If we remember from the last slide, wages go up, taxes go down, working time goes down, leisure time goes up. So this is what we're going to be having a look at. What did rich white Americans spend that extra cash on, and what do they spend their extra time doing? So one of the things that rich white Americans have a massive impact on is this idea of lots of new businesses starting up. And I say they have an impact on it because of what we were talking about previously with supply and demand. Lots more people wanting these new products, a lot more people being able to afford these new products as well, means that we see lots of new businesses starting up, making things like radios, again, always my go-to products, but yeah, radios, vacuum cleaners is another one of my go-to products as well. And we'll talk a little bit later on in this presentation about women as well. And one of the big industries that gets a boost during the 1920s is the beauty industry as well. So lots of new businesses starting up. As we mentioned before as well, thanks to mass production, it makes those products so much easier to buy and also makes them a lot cheaper to buy as well. Get lots of those products out there nice and quickly, keep that supply and demand ticking over. Cars, as we mentioned before, are a big mass production product, and I would argue one of the must-have products of the 1920s. Henry Ford, who was at one point the richest man in America, designed his Model T Ford. That is generally the car that people associate in the 1920s. And he famously said, you can have it in any colour you want as long as it's black, because they only made it in black, unlike today that we can get tons and tons of different colours. In America, there eventually was in the 1920s one car to every 5 people, which was absolutely huge. Perhaps in your study, when you looked at Henry Ford or you looked at cars in general, you would see how much higher that is compared to the likes of Britain and even the likes of Russia as well at this time. In 1929, 4.8 million cars were made, and thanks to their mass production methods, they were able to make one every 10 seconds. And again, perhaps in your study of Henry Ford and the Ford industry, you may well have seen just how far that came on from the beginning of the decade before those full-on mass production techniques were being used. And remember, if you couldn't afford to buy that car outright, then you could use that hire purchase. Buy now, pay later, buying it on credit. It's one of the reasons why so many people were buying cars, not just these super rich white Americans, but also your average everyday Americans as well. One of the biggest pastimes in America during the 1920s, and actually for pretty much all of our study, is going to the cinema. And going to the cinema back then, it was very different to how we go to the cinema nowadays. A lot of people would have gone to the cinema not only to watch a film, but also to receive news as well. It was one of the main ways. As well as reading a newspaper, people would find out about what was going on in the world. You'd have lots of these little pre-programs that were going on before your main feature started. Nothing like the saturation of advertising that we get nowadays when we go and watch movies, but it was really quite the event, and it was super cheap to go. You might well have heard of some of the TV channel Nickelodeon. Well, back in the day, a Nickelodeon was a cinema, and you'll know that there is obviously a brand of cinemas over here known as Odeons, and the idea was that it was so cheap to go to the cinema, you could go for a nickel. Okay, for a very, very small amount of money, hence a Nickelodeon. And the pastime was so popular. I love this statistic. I love it so, so much. 100 million tickets, cinema tickets, were sold every week. And nowadays, we in this country sell that many tickets probably in the space of a year. So that is a huge, huge, huge pastime. As well as that, the 1920s are synonymous with jazz music. And when we get to talking about Black Americans, we'll talk about their contribution into that as well. Jazz music, Charleston dancing as well, very popular pastime, especially amongst young people. Very much heavily criticised by the older generations who didn't like the sexualization of the dancing and the music that jazz represented in their minds. Sport is huge in America nowadays as well, but back then it was again a very, very popular pastime, and lots of people went to watch sports live. Boxing, baseball, and football, and that is American football, not soccer as they would refer to it. Real big business. The sports stars, much like today, even still, are being paid huge, huge, huge salaries, and lots of people buying tickets. And if you were unable to go to an event, there was always a radio that you could use to listen to those events as well. So sporting events becoming more and more popular. We talked previously about lots of businesses starting up in the 1920s, and one of the ways that rich white Americans were a big factor in this was that they were able to invest their money in these new companies and new businesses that were starting out on the stock market. And for much of the 1920s, the stock market was seen as a way to get rich quick. That you could get a return on your investment pretty quickly. Now, hopefully in your lessons, your teacher has explained to you how stocks and shares work. Maybe you've watched Dragon's Den before and you've got this idea that someone gives a certain amount of money in return for a certain share or percentage of that business. Now, for the majority of the 1920s, when businesses were doing really, really well, a lot of those new businesses that when they first started up, you could buy a share in quite cheaply and then became more and more successful, meant they were getting lots and lots of money for the price of their shares in their business. I don't want to go too much into that because for AQA specifically, you don't need to understand how the stock market worked or anything like that, but I'm hoping nonetheless it is gone through in your lessons and you have an understanding of why rich white Americans in particular were very, very keen on doing that. But what we start to see is people using the stock market as a form of gambling. The stock market is a form of gambling anyway, but we see a lot of people really, I was going to say cashing in, that's probably not the right phrase to use, but really taking advantage, that may be better, of this situation. We start to see the rising of these people known as speculators who would kind of play the system, who would get a loan from the bank to be able to invest in a company when the price of their shares was really low. And then once the price became high, they'd sell their shares and repay their loan and use whatever money they had left over to invest into a new business and start that cycle again. Now, obviously, if you have that money left over to do so, then that system works absolutely fine. But what we started to see happening were people making irresponsible investments, actually investing the money and not necessarily getting the return that they needed, only to loan more money from the bank and do the same cycle again. As we said previously in the last slide, banks were very willing to get that money out there. Okay, there were no problems there whatsoever, and because of that laissez-faire attitude of the government wasn't getting involved whatsoever. And these kind of sloppy banking practices, these speculators who were really gambling on playing the system in stocks and shares, contribute to the Wall Street crash, which happens on the 29th of October 1929. Okay. Our next group are the farming communities of America in the 1920s, and like pretty much most countries, America is a nation that is built on agriculture. There have been farmers in America for generations, and it's is a country where, compared to Britain, they have their industrial revolution much later on. By the time we get into the 1920s, it's fair to say that America is very much in the throes of their industrial revolution. They're very much going to see a rapid increase in industry during the 1920s. But that's not to say that farmers didn't exist anymore. And in fact, there were 30 million farmers in America during the 1920s. Now, you would generally find them much further south in America. Industrialization, the idea of big cities developing and factories and so on, was more so at this time seen in the north, but much further south, especially down into the southeast, where you would have had the plantations during slavery that was still around, even though slavery wasn't. But also you would have had very much in the middle of America, it's what they refer to as the Midwest. You would have had farms in families for generations going back, and the idea that those farms would be passed down through their generations as well. The big question that I often talk about when teaching the 1920s is this idea of, does everybody have a roaring time in the 1920s? We've just been looking at rich white Americans who very much did have a roaring 20s. Farmers are going to have a terrible time in the 1920s, and we're going to talk about the negatives in just a second. But also, these are the people who really hold on to their traditional values. When you're going further south, you're going into that kind of Bible Belt territory where religious attitudes also have a major factor to play as well. So 30 million farmers, not an insignificant number. That's a very, very large number, proportion of the population. And the reason they're having such a bad time in the 1920s is to do with overproduction. Now, during World War I, the Americans were asked by other nations to help produce food. We'll see that again leading up to World War II as well, but I don't want to go into that too much right now. But there are very, very similar things that happen during World War I with World War II. Also, when America enters the war, there's the need for rationing for the soldiers that are over there and so on. So farmers were producing more food than they had been previously because the demand, again, going back to that phrase, supply and demand, that demand for the food was there. But the thing was, once World War I was over, most farmers didn't scale back their production and they kept producing too much food, which led to, as we can see here, overproduction. Now, this means that you're going to get a lot of food going to waste that cannot be sold because there's only so many mouths to feed. And as we know, Fordney-McCumber tariff, we talked about that in a couple of slides ago, where America made it very expensive to bring products in to America. Other countries in the world retaliated and said, well, if you're going to make it expensive for us to bring our products to you, we're going to make it expensive for you to bring your products to us. So farmers couldn't even fall back on trade to other countries with all this overproduced products. As well as that, within America, the price of grain falls. So the price of grain is a kind of a phrase that we use in general to refer to how much food is costing, how much the producers get from the people who will then take it to market, then put it into the supermarkets and so on and so forth. Although supermarkets weren't really a thing at this time. But anyway, but the problem is that because the price of grain falls so much, the farmers aren't getting enough money for the crops they're producing. And like we said with overproduction, lots of their crops are just being laid to waste completely because they just can't have anything done, rotting literally in the fields because nobody wants it. We've also got as well competition from Canadian farmers to the north. And there are New machines as well, as it says here, being developed. Again, we saw this in our industrial revolution in Britain from 1750 to 1900. We see a lot of people losing their jobs on the farms because of these new machines being created and being made more readily available. Talked about hire purchase before, for instance. It can be translated onto that kind of machinery as well. So if you go from running an industry on a farm where you needed lots of hands to do the work, and then buying the machine that can do the work of 10 men, and you're in a situation where you're not getting enough money for the food you're producing, you can't afford to keep those people on. So farmers faced lots of unemployment during this time as well. 6 million farmers are evicted, thrown off of their land by the banks when they can't repay the loans for their land. And because, as well as, like I said, a lot of farms are passed down through the generations, we do still have people who are paying for their land like a mortgage, and that comes from the bank. And when you can't make your repayments, things are taken away from you. 6 million farmers have their land taken away from them. The 1920s are a truly bad time for farming communities, and as we'll see when we get onto it, the 1930s aren't going to get much better. The next group that we're going to be having a look at are immigrants in America during the 1920s. Now, before we go into some of the more specific details, I just wanted to share with you a graph that I use with groups to kind of understand the makeup of the American population. And the phrase that's often referred to the American population at this time is that it's very much a melting pot, that all of these different groups were almost part of like a big soup of America, and they all melted in there and became Americans as such. And the truth is very, very different to that. But back to the graph, as we can see, we have got quite a wide variety of different countries that have people migrating to America, and there's lots and lots of different reasons why. You may well in your lessons have looked at the idea of push and pull factors. What was it about where they were living that was pushing them away, and what was it about America that was pulling them towards it? Now, as we can see, if you look through the x-axes and the different countries, we'll notice that the vast majority of them are from mainland Europe. And we've got lots of different reasons as to why we've got a lot of people coming to America up around the year 1900. A lot of it is to do with opportunities in employment. There were fewer and fewer jobs in mainland Europe, especially with farming communities becoming less and less and industrial areas growing more and more. And people saw a move to America as a chance for a fresh start, to be able to get a job. There were stories that the streets in California were paved with gold and that you could make your fortune out there. In some countries, we also have a lot of people escaping persecution, Jewish people, especially from Russia, escaping persecution to want to move and live in a country which is founded on the concept of freedom of speech and freedom of worship. So we can see those from the middle there. Interesting that the highest bar is for people from Great Britain at this time. And interestingly, if you look further along to the right-hand side, Mexico, which, you know, if we've been following American politics in recent years, apparently that's a big issue for migration into America from Mexico. And again, if you look at the beginning of the x-axis with Canada, a country, we're looking at countries bordering onto America, where actually there weren't that many people going into there whatsoever. So we're going to look in more detail at the migrant experience in the 1920s and what we get, rather than, like I said, this melting pot of people becoming Americans when they step on that American soil, when they get off the boat and everything. Rather than getting that, is you get this idea of hyphenated Americans. So you start to get Irish Americans, Italian Americans, and so on and so forth as well. So looking into some more specific details now about immigrants. As we have seen from the graph, most of the migration to Europe up to and including the 1920s as well was from Europe, where people were fleeing persecution and were taking the opportunity for work and a better life. Now, for the purpose of what we're going to go through here, I'm not going to be talking so much about the migrants from all over Europe. We're going to focus on one specific country, which is Russia, and the migration from Russia following the 1917 Russian Revolution sparks this idea known as the Red Scare. Now, the Red Scare is something that appears twice in our AQA study. We see it first off here in the 1920s, but we'll see it appear again in the 1950s as well. So I don't want to go into too much detail about the Russian side of things here, but just to give you an idea of context, in 1917 we have the communist revolution that overthrows the Tsarist regime in Russia, and Lenin takes over and sets up his own communist government there. Now, hopefully your history teachers have been through the differences between capitalism and communism before, and you've got an idea a bit about this background of why it is America is so fearful of communism. To summarize it very, very basically, communism would mean the end to the way of life in America. It is the opposite to how America works. And the fear was that these people who were coming over from Russia and other countries in Eastern Europe as well were bringing communism to America, and that they were going to start to infiltrate it into American life to try and overthrow the government there and end the American way of life. Now, the irony, of course, being that surely if these people are leaving Russia, it's because they don't actually like communism. So why on earth would they be bringing it to America? But needless to say, there was some foundings to this kind of fear of communism coming to America, because some of them did bring that ideology over there unsuccessfully. We have some examples, extreme examples of immigrants rebelling against the government and using the communist style tactic of using a strike. And the way that the American government dealt with this is that if you were deemed to be a communist, is that you would be deported, you would be sent back to where you came from. And in the year 1920 alone, 10,000 immigrants were deported on suspicion of being communist for displaying certain behaviours that would seem to have you be like a communist, for instance, organising strikes. The worst parts, and when I say worst, I mean in terms of all of these people being deported and so on with the Red Scare, tend to happen quite early on in the 1920s. It seems to be fading away as such as the 20s go on, but trust me, that fear of communism in America never goes away, and many would argue still exists to this day as well. Two people that you likely will have learned about in your study who are seen as victims of the Red Scare are Sacco and Vanzetti, the two Italian migrants who were wrongfully executed in 1927 for a crime that they allegedly committed in 1921. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail here about who Sacco and Vanzetti were and their whole story and everything like that, but essentially the reason we call them victims of the Red Scare is because they were put on trial for allegedly committing this crime, but the main crime that they committed was that they were anarchists. They were people who wanted to overthrow the government, and so they tied that into this idea of being communist. Now, the trial was used to set an example to migrants to say, if this is how you're going to behave in this country, this is what's going to happen to you. But as we can see, from them committing the crime in 1921 to their execution in 27, we've got a significant gap of time. And that is because across the world, there were outcries that these two people were being punished for a crime that they never committed. And eventually in the 1970s, I believe it's the 1970s, the local government in Massachusetts, where this trial took place, turned around and said, yeah, sorry, it turns out that they were innocent. But the guy who was on the judge for their trial, Judge Thayer, was a notorious anti-communist, and he had already decided what was going to happen to these two guys before the trial had even started. And there's even evidence of him boasting to people about the fact he was going to send these two people to the electric chair. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that the evidence, again, that was put forward in their trial was fabricated. It was completely made up. So Sacco and Vanzetti are two good specific examples of people who were victims of the Red Scare that were used as examples by the American government to fear people away from communism. In 1924, one of the ways that America tried to control this flow of communists into America was they set up a quota that restricted the number of people who were allowed to enter America from Russia and Eastern Europe to try and reduce the numbers that were entering. Sounds very familiar to some of the strategies that President Trump wanted to do recently, during his time in office so far. And the 1924 restrictions did not cover countries like Germany, Great Britain, France. They were all seen as countries that were safe, and there were no restrictions on the number of people who could migrate from those areas. So we've got that idea of the Red Scare continuing and trying to put a stop to it. Like I said, a lot of the big events of the Red Scare happened earlier on in the 1920s, but that fear of communism hangs around for a very long time. I haven't written it on here, but just to talk loosely about the immigrant experience in the 1920s, you have got a lot of people who would have been in working class communities, who would have been mainly based in the industrial north, big cities like New York, Chicago, Baltimore, and so on. And a lot of them would be working for lower wages, and a lot of them again would be doing that manual labor. Those are the people who are fleshing out those assembly lines to construct products. Predominantly men, although immigrant women also worked mainly in very typical women's jobs, in jobs like cleaning and so on and so forth, being maids. And we also have a situation where the immigrants in America didn't all like mix together super friendly. They very much stuck to their own, and that is why when you go to cities like New York, for instance, you get areas known as Little Italy because of where all the Italian migrants would have come over and lived together in that little area there. That's why you get places like Chinatowns, for instance. And the idea was that people very much stuck to their own. And the next group we're going to look at is Black Americans. And the only time you could argue that immigrants kind of joined together was in their prejudice against Black Americans. The next group that we're going to have a look at are Black Americans. And throughout the Opportunity and Inequality study, these are the people who the most represent the concept of inequality in America, and the 1920s are no exception to that. Looking back a bit further, and again maybe your history teacher went through this with you, the history of Black Americans goes beyond the 1920s. We go back into the 1700s and into the 1800s when Black Americans were used for slave labour after they were brought over from the west coast of Africa during the transatlantic slave trade, which Britain also played its part. So Black Americans are not a new feature. They have very much been in American society and been an unequal part of American society for a very, very long time. Following the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, Abraham Lincoln officially ended slavery in America, and the slaves were freed, they were emancipated. However, a couple of years later, once the American Civil War is over, we get the introduction of the Jim Crow laws that force Black Americans to live separately but equal in the eyes of the law, at least they believed. So that's something in terms of the revision PowerPoints that I'm going through. I'm going to talk a lot more about segregation when we get to 1950s America, but be aware that that is very much in place during the 1920s. So the vast majority of Black Americans lived in the southern states because, again, that's where the slave plantations were for cotton, tobacco, and to an extent sugar as well. And when the slaves are freed back in the late 1800s, a lot of them pretty much stay where they are because for the vast majority of them, that's the only life they know. It's the only trade they know. However, as the time goes on, and despite the fact they have been emancipated and the racist tendencies of the South at that time tend to become more and more intense, we see a large number of Black Americans moving from those southern states up to the north, and it's known as the Great Migration. It's not the only time that a Great Migration takes place during the 1920s. It happens during other stages of our study as well. But here in this one, we're seeing 1 million Black Americans moving from the south to the north, generally for job opportunities. But again, a lot of Black Americans are really going to struggle when agriculture is pretty much all that they've known. Luckily, for things like jobs on production lines and so on, there wouldn't be a, how can I put this politely, in some production lines, some of the jobs wouldn't have required a high level of skill. So there are a lot of very easy to fall into jobs. A lot of them end up in the hospitality industry as well. And as we're going to look through for a kind of significant minority, we also have opportunities in the music industry too. So job opportunities are seen to be greater in the north, especially with growing industrialization, and like I said, this idea of escaping that racism in the south. Not to say that the north wasn't racist, that's not the case at all. There was still racism in the north, but nowhere to the extent that it had been down in the south. As mentioned, we've got the Jim Crow laws that are going on that are enforced across America. So this idea of Black Americans having separate facilities, the idea of, to some extent, in a lot of places, Black Americans being forced to live separately as well. Where they did live, the housing was of a very, very poor quality, where we start to get areas known as ghettos, not the same kind of ghettos as, for any of you who have studied Nazi Germany and the Holocaust may have heard of. They're not the same kind of thing, but those kind of poor quality housing areas, especially in the big cities, again, like New York and Chicago, where a lot of Black Americans lived. And despite the fact they had very poor housing, compared to white people, their rents were much, much higher. One of the things I didn't mention in that first point was about how although there were more job opportunities, there was a difference in pay for those who were white, essentially. Something we're also going to look at a little bit when we look at women in the 1920s as well. We talked about Black Americans moving north to escape the racism of the South, and the Ku Klux Klan, which had been around since before the 1920s, had been around, was established following on from the American Civil War. The KKK was growing in popularity during the 1920s, and I think it's fair to say in the early 20th century that was the case as well, where we see more and more European migrants coming over as well. So by 1925 we have over 5 million members in the KKK, most of which were down in the South. And as well as being against Black people, which is what they're most famous, I guess, for, the KKK were also anti-communist. Remember, the Red Scare was very strong at this time, so that kind of anti-communist attitude would have appealed to a lot of people. They were also anti-Catholic. They were very much a Protestant group. So they were anti-Catholic, and they were also highly anti-Semitic as well, so they were also against Jewish people too. But obviously we're looking at these guys in terms of Black Americans. A key term which I'm sure you've come across in your study, the idea about lynching, where people are executed without having a formal trial, is something that we see a lot. And I'm sure in your lessons you've been shown the famous photograph of the 2 Black men who have been hanged as well, have been lynched essentially. It's quite a dramatic photo. It's definitely one that would have stayed with you had you seen it. And the lynchings are very much attributed to the KKK, although they are not the only people who allowed them to take place. 300 lynchings between 1919 and 1925. How many of those are to do with the KKK, however, is hard to say. Lynchings were almost seen like popular entertainment down in the deep South, in those places where slavery had really been a huge way of life. It's in those areas where the racist attitudes really linger on, and to an extent where some people can still be seen to this day as well. So The KKK, very influential up until the mid-1920s, and feel free to research into this yourself if you are interested in the KKK, but some of the leaders, the Grand Wizards and the Imperial Wizards, do forgive me, I can't remember off the top of my head, make a few silly mistakes, and they kind of go into a bit of an underground state then. One of the things that often surprises students when I teach about the KKK is how many of them find it hard to believe that the KKK isn't illegal. Now, remember, America is a country which is founded on the belief of freedom of speech, freedom of expression. So if your freedom of speech and expression is that you want to say all of these anti-Black, anti-communist, anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic attitudes, then so be it. The Constitution protects your rights to be able to do that. However, it is when that prejudice is acted upon. So if people are committing crimes because of that, that's when we start to see problems with things becoming illegal. It's a bit of a tricky area, and is one of the reasons why the KKK still exists to an extent in America to this day. One of the big points of the Great Migration moving north is that jazz was able to move and develop, and Harlem in New York becomes a center of Black culture, and that continues throughout the 20th century beyond the 1920s as well, and even today is still very much synonymous with Black culture, music, poetry, cinema, theatre as well, with the likes of Josephine Baker, a very famous Black American actress at this time. One of the reasons jazz kind of goes hand in hand with these Black Americans is because the roots of the music are found in Black culture. They are found in the slave songs that were sung on the plantations, the roots from blues music as well, that are all kind of mashed into this new jazz culture that is being developing. Some of you may well have learned about that in your music lessons at school. Now, the 1920s is where we start to see the more common reference to groups which are set up to help Black Americans try and achieve some kind of equality. The first and most famous group, and a group that you'll hear of quite a bit in your study with Black Americans, especially when we get into the 1950s, is the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured Peoples. Now, coloured is not a term that we would use today, but back in the early 20th century, it was a very, very common phrase, not one that we would use today, but it has still maintained as part of that name there. And the NAACP, which was established by a gentleman called W.E.B. Du Bois, was very much focused on this idea of legally obtaining equal rights for Black Americans. And as you can see here, we have 90,000 members of the NAACP in 1919, which, you know, isn't an insignificant number. However, once we get into the aftermath of World War II and into the 1950s, we're going to see that number go up quite dramatically. We also have the UNIA, which is very similar to a Black Power group, and it was founded by a very famous gentleman called Marcus Garvey, who founded the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Again, Negro, not a term that we would use anymore, but back in the early 20th century, very popular. And it's interesting to see that those numbers are a lot higher compared to the NAACP, having over 1 million members in 1921. Despite that, the UNIA isn't really a group that we're going to hear much about. We will look more at Black Power when we get into the 1960s, and there's definitely inspiration kind of tracking back to this group and to Marcus Garvey as well. But the main difference between our two groups, the NAACP, as I mentioned before, is very much focused on trying to establish equal rights, equal legal rights for Black Americans. The UNIA, as a Black Power group, is more about Black people taking pride in their Black heritage and their Black identity as well. This concept of Black Power is something we'll explore a lot more when we get into our study of the 1960s. So we're going to move on now to look at women in the 1920s, and this is a great group to help you understand the idea of, did everyone have the same experience of the 1920s? Now, thinking of that in terms of women, did all women have a roaring 1920s? And that's something we're going to have a think about when we get towards the end of this slide here. Now, the typical image of the 1920s as a whole is of the flapper. And hopefully in your lessons you got to see some images of flappers and you can identify what they would look like. The short hairstyles, which back then were described as being boyish, short skirts, especially lots of the tassels and everything, which were great for doing the Charleston dancing, the feather in the hair. You would identify them smoking out in public, drinking in public, and also a big thing for this time, this idea of going out without a chaperone, so someone who would be there to watch and make sure you were behaving yourself. Very much something for the rich, young, urban woman. That's very much where the flappers would be. I find it incredibly hard to imagine that you would find a flapper on a farm in Midwest, like Oklahoma or somewhere like that. I find it very hard to imagine you would find one there. But for the cities, especially New York, it's such a kind of massive cosmopolitan area where these women are able to live so much more freely than their predecessors had. And the car is a big part of that social freedom, but we're also seeing a kind of development in attitudes. This idea that women want to be able to go out on their own. They want to have that social freedom. And also, it's kind of part of many women going into the workforce as well. For those women who remain in that traditional role of the housewife at this time, we see women being put more at the forefront of the way that money is spent in the household. So they are the ones who are the focus for advertising, in terms of advertising things like my go-to product, the vacuum cleaner. And that means we start to see them almost grow in a bit of consumer power, very similar to how we're going to see that happen with teenagers in the 1950s. More on that obviously when we get to our 1950s revision PowerPoint. So more products are being made for the home, and they are completely targeted at women, and the advertising sees women as the decision makers in their household for the very first time. Previously, it was very much the job of the man. For women in those rural areas out in the farming communities, life stays the same. There is still very much that expectation of women having traditional roles. We've got the areas like that Bible Belt, which I've referred to before, down in the deep south, where very religious attitudes would also see women being seen as submissive in their lifestyle. But nonetheless, rural women worked incredibly hard on the farms, and as well as that, still had the expectation of raising a family and keeping home as well. So a great example here when we're talking about, did all women in the 1920s have the same experience? Did they all have a roaring 20s? Well, no, actually most of them really didn't. And for most of them, life stayed pretty much the same as it always had been. In the cities and the urban areas, we see more and more women going into the workforce. Now, for the majority of women, this isn't in hard manual physical labour. It's in very much quote unquote women's jobs, secretarial work, teaching to an extent, and other jobs like cleaning and making products like clothing and so on and so forth as well. And one of the reasons why we see so many women going into the workforce is because they did not get the same level of pay as that of a man. So men were very keen, business owners, were very keen to employ women because they were much cheaper to pay. And also for a lot of them were very willing to do that work. I've said here in brackets that it was a lot of unmarried urban women, because back at this time in the 1920s, the belief was, and the attitude was, that as soon as you got married, you would have to give up your job, because then you would be going into your role as a housewife and mother, and you would be having children and bringing your family up from there. An attitude which hangs around for quite some time, as we will see. So in the urban cities, those rich young urban women who we were talking about beforehand, those flappers, they're the ones who are going into those jobs unmarried, again, single women at this stage. You were allowed to have a boyfriend and everything, but you, as soon as you got that ring on your finger to say you were going to be married, you would have been told your time in this job is coming to an end. We see, as the 1920s go on, a change in attitude towards the traditional family, and the idea that if you are in a marriage where you are unhappy, then that's tough, which had been the attitude for centuries. As it says in point number 5, we see that by 1929 there are twice as many divorces than there were back in 1914, demonstrating that women are not willing to stay in unhappy marital circumstances, not willing to stay in unhappy marriages, and are feeling more confident in becoming more independent. There was still a bit of a stigma hanging around the idea of being a divorced woman, more so than being a divorced man, but that's another topic for another day. But nonetheless, it definitely shows this kind of change in attitude amongst women, where they are feeling a lot more confident to take control of their own lives. And finally, an area that is completely unique to 1920s America is Prohibition. It lasted from January 1920 right the way through to December 1933, and it was the prohibiting the illegal buying, selling and producing of alcohol. It is also known as the Volstead Act, just in case it comes up in a source or something like that, or a question possibly. Although if it wasn't a source, I imagine they would tell you that the Volstead Act was prohibition, but just in case, the Volstead Act. And some people find it really hard to believe that such a ban was around for 13 years, but it was a feature of American life, the Great Experiment as it was known as, and as you would have learned from your studies, a massive failure. So Prohibition was introduced to try and make America a morally better place. The temperance movement, which you may well have come across, was a religious idea that alcohol was making America a morally corrupt society, and that if alcohol was banned, then America would become a better place. You may also have come across the Anti-Saloon League, which produced loads of propaganda demonstrating how selfish alcohol purchasing was, especially by men. It was a lot of men buying the alcohol in their propaganda at the expense of their poor wives and children that were at home, some of them starving because their father was wasting money on alcohol instead of providing for them. So the idea of banning alcohol to make America a morally better place seemed to be a very, very popular one at that time, to the extent where the law was introduced. And also the likes of Henry Ford were very much in favour of it, because a sober worker would mean a worker who was not ever hungover, and you would not want a hungover worker making your products, and a sober worker would be able to make them much more efficiently. An idea that was also quite popular around the time when Prohibition was first introduced, remember America gets involved in World War I in 1917, was this idea that it was patriotic to not drink alcohol, because a lot of the breweries in America were owned by German businesses, German families. So if you were seen to be drinking this beer, for instance, that was made by a German family, then it was like you were supporting the Germans in the war. Obviously, an idea that as the 1920s goes on becomes less and less relevant, but when it's first introduced back in January 1920, and when all of that propaganda was going around before January 1920, this isn't an idea that came out of the blue. It had been hanging around for quite some time. It was an idea that a lot of people were willing to latch onto. So what do you do when you can't buy alcohol anywhere? You go to somewhere where you can buy it illegally. And these were known as speakeasies, these bars, these saloons that were hidden in the back of shops that you could go to. You would have to have a special password, maybe a secret knock or something, to be able to go in. You might have seen it in a couple of movies. For instance, The Great Gatsby, the most recent one that Baz Luhrmann directed with Leonardo DiCaprio in it. Their speakeasy that is featured in the film is in the back of a barber's shop. You may well have seen, although maybe not quite as realistic, but nonetheless we'll run with it. You might have seen Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, where they go to a special kind of speakeasy for the kind of magical society, if you will. Another great example, actually, just thinking about that scene of jazz music and flappers as well. And if you want a nice retro kind of vintage example, there's a Marilyn Monroe movie, Some Like It Hot, where the speakeasy is in the back of a funeral parlour. So they would hide them away so as to escape the eyes of the law. However, and you'll see this in a lot of the movies as well, most of the time there were policemen inside the speakeasies getting a drink anyway. But more on that in a little bit. The speakeasies were generally run by gangsters, like the most famous one, Al Capone, who made $60 million a year from his speakeasies. And that kind of connects the idea of gangster culture to the 1920s. They're very much linked to this idea of prohibition. When prohibition ends in the 1930s, we kind of see the influence of gangster culture kind of drift away somewhat and kind of go into the more underground again. And Al Capone himself, into the 1930s, finds himself in prison, not for anything to do with gangster activity, but for not paying his taxes. Just a little bit of a fact for you there. Some people made their own alcohol as well, like out in the rural areas where you would get the bathtubs filled up with all sorts of different kind of spirits that you could get your hands on. And this homemade alcohol was known as moonshine. And a lot of people made it for themselves. Some of them chose to sell it. Now, another key term where you sell alcohol illegally is known as bootlegging. Okay, so that's another phrase that you may well have come across as well. Gangsters were big bootleggers, kind of going hand in hand with running the speakeasies as well. But in the cities and everything, you wouldn't really get moonshine in your speakeasies. That was much more of a rural thing. So one of the things that the American government introduces during the 1920s to deal with prohibition is prohibition agents, because if you're going to introduce a law, you're going to need to make sure that people are doing as they're told. And there was no way, with the law being such a big one, that the police force as themselves would be able to run it. So prohibition agents were kind of a splinter group of the police force. They had a massive job to do and were very, very poorly paid for the job that they had to do. And because of that, most of them were very easily bribed by gangsters to kind of turn a blind eye to the actions that were going on. And when you're being poorly paid and you need to put food on the table of your family, you're going to be willing to take those bribes. And like I said earlier, it was very common for the speakeasies to actually have members of the police force frequenting them, those prohibition agents actually being there. One of my favourite stories from teaching about prohibition, and again one that your teacher might have done with you as well, is about a prohibition agent who was kind of acting undercover to see how long it would take him to get served alcohol in different locations. And in like the big cities, it took him let's say maybe a couple of days, maybe a couple of hours, but when he went to New Orleans down in Louisiana in the South, and he asked his taxi driver, where can I get a drink around here? His taxi driver actually offered him a drink in the taxi itself. So that was a matter of seconds it took for them to be able to find alcohol. So Prohibition agents, massive job, massive job, and trying to enforce a law that pretty much nobody wanted to be in place in the first place is always going to be a tough one. So as we can see, bribes are a big part of it, and we see lots of corruption during the Prohibition era. The idea that gangsters were paying off even judges to make sure that in the rare event that they were actually put on trial, that they were found innocent, or that if they were found guilty, their punishments would be lenient. Lots and lots of corruption going on. Again, another, I know, favourite of my students is the story of the guy who is in charge of, I think it's the FBI, forgive me, who told his officers to put their hands on the table, and anybody who was seen to be wearing a diamond was fired, because you shouldn't really be able to afford that kind of luxurious jewellery on the wages that you were being given. So it was clear that you were being given a bribe. So lots of corruption going on. We talked earlier about how Prohibition was a massive failure. It is so hard to pinpoint the blame on one particular person or group of people, because everybody was willing to break this law. The gangsters were willing to supply that alcohol, very willing to get rich off it. People were willing to buy the alcohol as well because they wanted it. And the Prohibition agents were willing to turn a blind eye because they were being paid so poorly. So it was all a mess. How it lasted for 13 years is beyond me, but it kind of clearly shows that people weren't really paying much attention to it. And that's it. Good job, everybody. That was a long hour, but I really hope that you found this interesting, and I hope you found it useful as well. More importantly, and this might sound odd, I kind of hope that you've sat through this and thought, yeah, I know this already, because you do. It's revision. It's going over exactly what you've been taught already. However, if you do have any questions, then please feel free to give me an email. If you are a student of mine, then you have my details already. As you can see, you can follow me on Twitter or on Instagram at @OneHistoryHelp. And on those accounts as well, I'll be kind of putting some links to when new videos go up, but also to other bits and bobs out there on the internet that I feel would be useful for your revision. And also make sure you click on the subscribe button as well, so you can get notified when I get those new videos up onto YouTube. Got lots and lots to come. We've obviously got the other decades from on America study. We've got the other areas of the GCSE history course with AQA predominantly, and the course that I'm teaching at the moment was the main one. But there's also going to be lots of advice out there on revision skills that you can not only apply to history, but to lots and lots of other subjects as well. So lots more to come, and it'd be great to see you there. Thank you so much for your time. Again, I really hope you found this useful, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.